Welcome to the MAM journals. Now, I'm a motorcycling enthusiast, not an expert, although they both begin with E, they are very different things. But I have got a bit of a soft spot for World Superbike homologation bikes. And when a friend of mine, Mike Austin, very kindly said, well, I could always get my RC45 recommissioned and you could have a go on that. The only sound to be heard was that of his arm being ripped off. It was my very first opportunity to have a ride on the RVF750 RC45. So my thanks to Mike, my thanks to King's Two-Wheel Centre for recommissioning the bike and getting it in a state for me to actually ride on the road, MOT, new tyres and a check over. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Jim Lindsay. Because I'm not an expert, what I have got is enough common sense to actually ask people who know more about the bikes than I do to help me verify my facts and get as much as I can right. Jim was extremely helpful. Thank you. I think it's also right that I say any mistakes that I've made are entirely my own. Now, what I'm going to be doing today is we're going to go through the specifications of the bike. I do actually, unusually for these iconic bikes, I'm actually going to take it for a ride and GoPro, and then I'm going to come back and give you my first impressions of this iconic Honda. I hope you enjoy watching it as much as I've enjoyed making it. Right, so let's go through the specifications of the bike. Some people say to me, well, I don't know why you do the specs in such detail, but I think it's a great opportunity to get up close and personal and see the bike the same way that I see it in close proximity. And hopefully I can add a couple of comments, give you insight as to what they were thinking about when they developed and built it the way that they did. So let's start with the engine. It is of course a fully fed bike, so you can't see much of the details, but we'll try and work our way through that. Honda do love a V4, and this bike is a 749cc. It's a 90-degree, 16-valve, liquid-cooled, gear-driven, double overhead cams, and most of you will be familiar with that concept. The reason why people use gears is about precision of timing at high revs, and as opposed to belts or chains. It does have its technical advantages, although it has disadvantages as well, because for example, if you want to skim ahead and increase the compression, it's a lot more difficult if you can't adjust the cams, because the gears have got very little adjustments in them. They're designed to deliver precision at high revs. The bore on this bike, and the reason I mention it is it's slightly different from what Honda normally did. The bore is 72 times 46, and with the Hondas, it always used to be 70 times 48. So again, a bit of a step away from the normal and gives you a clue as to what they were trying to achieve. The cylinder bores are made of what they described as a metal composite, and apparently it was a blended ceramic and aluminium mix that could be rebored. The bike produces 118 brake horsepower. Now sometimes when I'm reading the specs I see 120, but the 120 is actually Förderstärken, PS, which was the German measurement, and German horses are clearly slightly smaller than British horses for the brake horsepower. It produces that power at 12,000 revs. They actually had two variants. That one of the engines produces 100 brake horsepower. I think that was about legislation, America for example, but they are easy to convert. Apparently it's a straightforward sort of switching around of some connections in order to make it back to the full 118 brake horsepower. The bike produces 75 Newton meters of torque at 10,000 revs, and if you think in old money, that's 56 pound-foot. One of the challenges with these V engines is temperature control, because clearly the front is more exposed to the air than the rear, where you can get heat building up. And anybody who's built a V4, a V, whether it be the V twins, the Ducatis, or the V4s, struggled with cooling. Keeping them cooling was important because you need the right temperature and right mix of air and fuel to get the thing to run properly. If you look in here, their cooling solution was, it's actually radiators at the front here. And to try and help a bit, around here you can see they've actually, that's where the oil cooler is. So clearly they were minded that this was a high revving bike, and trying to keep the thing cool was going to be a challenge. I've actually got some other bikes and I'll show you some solutions, but we'll do that a bit later. These, whilst we're at the front here and talking about these air scoops coming in here, and they pull in from the front, was that solution at that time in order to try and get air through. Various manufacturers tried different ways of doing it. Again, we'll touch on that later as to how they got there. It certainly makes for a very distinct look with these air intakes attached to the top of the tank there. Part of the really clear identifying features when you see one of these on the road. The bike, unlike its predecessor, the RC30, is actually fuel injected, a fairly primitive system. It wasn't the first bike to have it on. I think the oval piston NR750 had. The system is based on what they put on that. As I say, the 30 had 38 Cayennes, and this has got 4x46 throttle bodies. Again, if we pop round the other side, this always throws me a little bit. It says choke. Now, obviously, fuel injection and choke don't sort of go together really, so it's not actually a choke in a conventional system. What it's doing is when you lift it, it's slightly lifting the throttle bodies just to get a bit more in there for your cold start. This, by the way, here, slightly unusual for a fuel injected bike. You don't see them now. That's the idle speed adjuster. Okay, so let's start at the front end and have a look around. I'll start with the wheel really, because that's quite an unusual wheel to see on a bike of this era. That is a 6-spoke cast alloy, 3.5 times 16 inch, and it actually they originally came with Dunlop 130/70 ZRs on. This has obviously got Bridgestones on, and these are Shower upside down forks. They're 41mm. I've read somewhere that they're actually CBR 600 forks, but I'm not sure whether that's right or not. The rake is 24.5 degrees, so pretty much in keeping with most of the sports bikes of its time and era. It's got compression, rebound and preload adjustment on the bike. The brakes are Nissans and 2x310, and these are 4-piston calipers, and this one has been fitted with braided lines. I think they all came with rubber lines, and again I'll show you something a bit later from a different bike to give you a feel for it, but these are nice and direct, and you can see they come up there. The sort of view I think Honda seem to have taken with their homologation bikes is generally, don't worry too much about what you put on them, because if anybody actually wants to race them, you just buy the race kit and throw half the stuff they put on it into the skip and start again. But this is the road version, and that's what they came, these Nissans is what they came fitted with. I like the twin headlamp look about them, very distinctive, and certainly part of the character of this bike. There's very little that's not original on this bike. These indicators are that, and the braided hoses on the front are probably the only two things that I've spotted, but I'm sure there'll be some experts watching who will say, oh no, you've missed X, Y and Z. And please feel free to make a comment on it. I'm an enthusiast, not an expert. I'm very happy to be corrected. Right, so going to the rear of the bike, you've got obviously the most obvious thing is it's a single-sided swing arm, indeed like the RC30, and it's attached to this aluminium perimeter frame. I'm getting sort of diamond somewhere in my head in terms of the descriptions, but again, experts might tell me no, that's not the diamond style frame, but it is definitely an aluminium perimeter. Now, wheel at the back, this has got 8 spokes, 6 by 17 inch cast alloys, and it's fitted with 190/50 ZR17s. In the rear here, you can see it's a Showa suspension unit, and that's a gas charged monoshock with an integrated reservoir, and again you can adjust preload, compression and rebound. That's got 130 millimeters of travel. I think the front was 120. Just to be clear, this is the road version. No race bikes raced in these specifications. There were, as I mentioned, race packs available, and they included cams, brakes, exhaust, suspension, wheels, radiators. I mean, the list was enormous, and if you thought the bike was expensive to buy, you should feel it when you've actually made it ready for the races, for a racetrack. Right, before we sort of step back and have a look at the RC45 from a distance, I just wanted to show you these 3 bikes and pick up a few of the things that I've just mentioned on the RC45. Now, this is an SPY, in other words, the 2000 bike, and was Honda's first homologation bike for the bike that won the championship in the year 2000. Now, that one over there, the next one, is the 996R, which is a later version of the bike that proved to be the nemesis of the RC45, the 916s and the 996s. Ironically, actually, you can see it says 996R here, but well, that's actually a victory of marketing over technical reality, because that actually isn't a 996 engine. They are 998 engines, the narrowhead engines that are fitted to that bike. But I suspect it was about, they still had a number of 996s to sell, so launching a new race bike that was a 998 was probably not the right timing. They later confessed to it being a 998 and called it the 998R. It's not the first time they've done that, in fairness. So that's that bike. That was the homologation bike that won the 2001 championship, and that's Honda's response, the SP2, which had some changes in terms of chassis, where they're trying to deal with things and fueling. And that was the one that Colin Edwards won the 2002 World Superbike Championship. Just going through a few details, if I go back to this SP1, you can see cooling was an issue, and this is their solution, because this bike is the one that followed the RC45. And trying to keep the thing cool, they actually ended up putting 2 of these side mounters, one either side, to try and get cooling. And I talked about brake hoses being rubber on. This is an absolutely standard bike. I've had this bike from new, so I know exactly what's happened to it. You can see this has got rubber hoses, and it's got a little junction box. It's not direct, down at the bottom, which links the 2 as they come up there, as opposed to the solution we've seen on the other one. Another interesting, we talked about air intakes and changing. This, I think, was one of the first bikes that had this great big front air intake, which goes through a box section, aluminium box section, goes straight into the air, as they were desperately trying to get more air into the bike and then get that right mixture of temperature. The 996, just again showing you on that, their solutions, that's got a little oil cooler on the bottom and a big radiator on the top, as they were trying to keep the thing cool. You can see this is Ducati's solution with these vents either side here, which ran up to these carbon units in here, pulling the air in at the back there. Going to this SP2, again, you can see this modification. I'm the second owner of this bike, and the first owner had a bit of an engine. It was an engineer, and he put the braided hoses in to improve the braking, and again takes out the junction box and does it direct in there. Very similar to the modification we've seen on the RC45. And actually, interestingly, these bikes, although they are later bikes, they are all fitted with 17-inch front wheels. I always think it's nice to stand back and get a proper perspective of the bike. As I've touched on, this is the road version. They did actually do a couple of road versions, or at least a couple. I know they did an R and an S version. I'm going to try and avoid going into too much detail because otherwise we will be here for a week and I'll be enjoying myself far too much. But looking at that perspective of it, you can see the sort of dimensions of the bike. It's, in terms of weight, the bike actually weighs 189 kilograms dry, and it's got an 18-litre fuel tank on it, so that in itself would be full, be 13.3 kilos on top of that. So by the time you put some oil in it, I'd be surprised if this bike didn't weigh 205 kilograms, which is not light. In old money, that's 450 pounds. So for a homologation bike, it is quite a heavy thing. It's got a nice low seat on it, 770 millimetres. You're definitely in it, not on it. And I think that's to do with them wanting to get the centre of gravity low in relation to handling. It is very nicely built. Sorry, wheelbase. The wheelbase, typical sort of sports bike wheelbase, quite short, 1410 millimetres. So going back to the build, I mean, they are beautifully built. There is a bit of, don't be offended by this, but there is a bit of parts bin raiding going on in there, because as I touched on earlier, I think those forks are CBR 600, and those rear sets, I'm pretty sure I've seen those before on something. And when we get up to the top and we go through the sort of top and switch gear, I think that's CB 900 Fireblade switch gear. But the air scoop is clearly a very distinguishing feature. Now, whether you like the overall look is, of course, entirely subjective. And I do really like the look, but I can't help but think I'm probably influenced by the fact it is an RC45. And I know all its historical connotations and how special a bike that it was. I think if you saw that as a road bike, it may be less attractive, but I think the fact that it's so rare makes it very special. Right, so how rare is it? Now, at this point, I have to make a bit of a confession. When I went out and stopped in various places for coffee and was out riding it, invariably people were coming up to me and saying, that's a very special bike, really rare. And I couldn't resist the temptation to ask them, well, how rare is it? How many bikes do you actually think were made? And you won't be surprised to hear the width of guesses was enormous. And it has been quite difficult to find out the answer to that question. And the truth is, I don't know to this day. But we'll just have a bit of fun. In the 1996 regulations, they told you how many bikes you had to make in order to qualify and homologate your bike for World Superbike racing. Was the answer 1,000, 500 or 200? Hopefully you've had a guess at that number. And if I tell you in an equal opportunity world that you're all right, whichever of those numbers you came, it will tell you how complex it is, because how many bikes you had to make depended on how many bikes you made in the first place. So if you made 100,000 bikes a year, you had to make 1,000. If you made 50,000 bikes a year, you had to make 500. If you made less than 50,000 bikes a year, you had to make 200. Now, anytime I've looked, Honda have made tens of millions of bikes. So clearly they must, in order to have complied with the regulations, they must have made at least 1,000. Now, how many more than that they made, I don't know. I've seen guesses, 1,300. Apparently there's a paper out there where someone says there's about 2,000, but we'll not know. But one thing we do know is it is a comparatively known number, and they certainly made significantly less of these than they did of the RC30. So, how much were they? Well, again, I've seen various numbers out there. I think they were £17,800 when they were new, so quite a lot of money. Other people say they were £18,300. Now, let's call it £18,000. That's the same sort of money that you were talking about for the equivalent Ducati at the time. What is pretty clear is that not many of the bikes that sold in the showrooms actually went on for a racing career. To modify it sufficiently to make it race competitive was an enormous sum of money, and not many opted to go that route. Okay, so let's have a look at the dash, and it's quite nice to not have a load of buttons to cursor you through all the systems and adjustment on it, because obviously it's a bike of its era. In terms of the suspension front fork settings, this is slightly different from modern bikes, where they tend to do one fork does one thing and the other fork does something else, and they work them in that way. In these days, each fork had its own rebound adjustment and compression on each leg, and you could also have that gnarled nut with the lines on to actually adjust the preload for the tension in the front springs if you wanted to stiffen it up. The bike is fitted with, I think, a lot of this switch gear in here is actually, I think it's Fireblade, but I may be wrong, open to be corrected. The dash itself, fairly basic in terms of, look, you've got a speedo on one side and you've got the rev counter on the other. And this is a bike that likes to be revved. It's hilarious. Very simple gauge, oil and fuel injection warning light. You've also got in there turn when you're in neutral, high beam, and a side stand indicator as well. You can see the little reservoirs on the clutch. We'll talk about the clutch when we go out for a ride, because it's got a very tall first gear. And obviously over here you can see the brake master cylinder. The other little warning light, of course, it's got the fuel one under the bezel, which it normally consists of yes please, but part of the fun of the bike. I think it's a lovely, very traditional, proper race bike feel to it. Clearly they never raced with speedos for obvious reasons, but as a road bike, doesn't it look great? Right, so before we go for a ride, I just wanted to sort of show you the riding position as it is. You can see it's got quite a low seat, and I've actually got, just see if I can show you safely. You can see I've got 29.5-inch inside leg, and I've got virtually flat foot on the bike. Now, clearly, most of us road riders, and I'm definitely a road rider, not a track rider, we ride with our feet in this position where it's sort of in the heel. If the shoe had a heel, it would be in the heel position. But of course, that's not how proper riders ride. And this position that I'm in is not really the position they had. They would be further back with their toe on the pegs, which actually gives you more of a natural tuck and a better view of the instruments when we go. Right. We're going to go for a ride, and clearly there's sort of limited benefit. An older guy who's a road rider can show you on a bike like this. So what I'm going to do, I will give you my personal impressions of what it's like to ride on the road as an average road rider. What I'm going to take the opportunity to do as well, whilst you watch the video, is to talk about the sporting history. And in particular, I thought it'd be useful to talk about what Aaron Slight, the man who probably put the most miles on this bike in its race form, thought about it, and some of his thoughts about the development over time. Hope that you enjoy it. In my normal bike reviews, I tend to take the bike on different roads. I take it through towns, I pop it along a sort of local road where I do a bump test, but I'm not sure that that's actually an appropriate approach for a homologation bike like this. I've actually ridden 6, maybe 7 homologation bikes over the years, and I've got to be honest, none of them really like riding slowly in traffic. As an example, my SP1 and 2, they're rock solid, the fuel injection hunts and the clutch is heavy. It's just not fun. The Ducati 996R, that will cook your nether regions in 10 minutes as it sits in traffic. So the RC45 is definitely not a fan of slow moving traffic, but I think it hates it slightly less. The suspension is much plusher, and generally speaking it just feels an easier bike to ride. It has got a tall first gear, and tales of stalling this bike or burning the clutch out are synonymous with RC45s, but I think they over-egg that slightly. It does need a few revs to sort of pull away, and I was determined not to stall it, so I probably gave it on occasion slightly too many revs, but actually it only needs 2,500, 3,000 revs and you slip the clutch. Modern bikes, of course, we tend to have clutch assist systems which do all that sort of stuff for you, but back in the 80s and 90s we actually had to ride them. All I had to do was just remember how to do that, and by the end of my time on the bike I was comfortably pulling away without being hard on the clutch and finding it easy to engage. Apparently there's no cush drive on this. I didn't take the wheel off, so obviously I don't know for a fact that that's the case, but that would certainly explain the occasional, what I would describe as a shunting effect if you're on and off the throttle at slow speeds. So it's not overly fond of slow speed traffic, but certainly very rideable. In terms of riding position, it's actually not as tough on my hands as some other bikes like this which I ride, which I found refreshing. The pegs are high and your legs are very tucked. There's not many times that I'm grateful for having a 29.5 inch inside leg, but this was one of them. It certainly gave me a bit more room. I think tall riders would struggle on riding a bike of this riding position for any length of time. When I ride bikes, I actually sometimes get sort of flashbacks of previous bikes that I've ridden, and this bike, I suddenly found myself thinking about a VF400F that I had in the early 80s. That was a 90-degree V4. It weighed about the same, slightly lighter, of course, obviously being a smaller engine. It had a short little wheelbase, it had a low seat, a 16-inch front wheel, and a single shrouded disc at the front, which was, which I digress slightly, was so poor that I could rarely get my 12-mile commute without the brakes fading that much that I could pull the lever back to the bar and watch the brake fluid boiling in the tiny little reservoir attached to the master cylinder. I can understand why they've not made a comeback, but what was of interest was this 16-inch wheel, because it made the 400 pretty twitchy really, but with this much nicer and much more sophisticated RC45, it was actually really precise. It was quick to steer and it was very predictable. Just how I actually like my front ends on many sports bikes. The suspension was plush and sure-footed, and even coped with our pothole damaged surfaces that we nowadays call roads. The handling inspired both confidence and trust. In terms of the engine, well, 118 horsepower is not powerful by modern standards. Indeed, most of the bikes I've got in my garage have got more than that, and it's not intimidating to ride, but it is certainly a brisk bike on the road. In road gearing, it apparently is geared for 165 miles an hour, but racing gearing is obviously completely different depending on the circuit that you're racing on. It is usable at low revs. It's not particularly torquey, and it does like its revs. This bike at 12, it's a V4 at 12,000 revs. It makes a noise to die for. If it doesn't make you smile, you're tired of life. It was absolutely stunning. Tempting as it was to run it everywhere at 12,000 revs, I was, however, a bit more cautious. This bike is far more capable than a video like this can demonstrate. I think there's a number of reasons, most of which will be obvious to you. It was not my bike. The speed limits nowadays, they're a little more ferociously policed than they were in '94 when this bike was launched, and I actually know how busy these roads are. I ride all the year round, and I've encountered along this very road tractors with 40-foot trailers taking both sides of the road, 40-mile-an-hour Cotswold tourists tootling along, and my favourite, a mobility scooter right on the racing line. On the roads, I've actually taken the view that discretion is better than valour. It didn't, however, detract from my pleasure. This, as we used to say in the 90s, is a proper bit of kit. It's inspiring, it's special, and it is an easy bike to ride. It's possibly the easiest homologation bike that I've ridden, although my 996R is very easy to ride on smooth roads and an absolute joy. But you hit a bump on that, you will be lifted from the seat. Lifting from the seat, of course, is not the problem. It's the landing which can get a bit eye-watering. The brakes, which are on this bike, which have been modified at the front, as we discussed when we went through the specifications, were more than adequate for my needs at the sort of speeds that I was travelling. Reflecting on sort of full-on sports bikes, I actually recognise that I'm a fan of really nice 750s. I find 600s on the road just a bit too busy and too frenetic for me, and I love the 1000cc full-on sports bikes, but their engine stroke chassis sweet spot is significantly higher than the speed which reaches the UK threshold for prison food. And now this 750 can of course do those sort of speeds, but it's still fun to ride at a more sensible pace. Anyway, that's probably enough of what an average rider like myself feels about the bike. Let's talk about its race history. The bike was racing between 1994 and 1999. Clearly one of its main objectives would have been, of course, to win the World Superbike competition, and indeed it did in 1997 with a brilliant John Kosinski riding it. He was a brilliant rider with a slightly unusual personality that made OCD look normal. Aaron Slight, a Kiwi rider and very talented, rode the bike throughout that period. He managed 2 second places and was third on 4 occasions. It would have been 3-3 if Kosinski hadn't actually overtaken him on the last race in the 1997, which prevented Honda from getting a 1-2. I bet that went down well in Japan. But anyway, the bike actually won the AMA Championship 2 times, and it won the Australian Championship twice as well. It didn't trouble the scorers in the British Series. At the TT, the bike won the Senior TT 94, 95, 96, 97 and 98. The Yamaha beat it in 99, and it was exactly the same with the F1. 5 wins followed by a defeat by Yamaha. Interestingly enough, when they launched the bike in 94, Steve Hislop was riding it, and he was doing a review for Bike magazine when they were doing, because the 916 was launched at the same time, so they were doing a sort of back-to-back comparison between the RC45 and the 916, and Hislop in the pub afterwards said to one of the journalists that he thought the 916 was better, and you can imagine how pleased Honda were to arrive at the Isle of Man to find the headline news in Bike magazine, their works rider, saying they thought the 916 was better. Another guy who was brilliant on the track, but not always quite as brilliant off it. Anyway, his career survived, and he was, what anybody says of him, a brilliant rider. Now, in endurance racing, the bike won twice. It won the championship in 95 and in 98, so it's clearly a fast and reliable bike. But I think that the most compelling evidence that this is a really successful race bike was its record at the Suzuka 8-hour race. Now, in the Western world, we don't put so much store on this, but in Asian markets, this is really one of the highlights of the racing year. It's a race over 8 hours with 2 riders, and it tests a bike to its maximum. It's got to be fast, it's got to be durable, and if possible you need to turn the fuel down enough so that you can actually miss one of the fuel stops that your competitors need to do. It's a really tough race to win, and they actually won it like they did at the TT 5 years on the trot, and it was only in 99 when the Yamaha YZF750 pipped it. Now that to me tells me it is a successful race bike, and it's certainly more successful than some would like to suggest. I suspect that the reason they do say that is because its lack of wins in the perhaps most important series, World Superbikes. Now, World Superbikes was launched in 1988, and in the 12 years that spanned the RC30 and RC45 era, 88 to 2000, a Honda rider won it 3 times. That was Merkel twice and Kosinski once. A Kawasaki rider won won it once. That was Scott Russell on the ZRX750R, and Ducati won it the other 8. Regulations played a big part in this. The 750 cylinder or up to 999cc twin regulations clearly suited the twins. So what did Aaron Slight think of the bike? Well, he's probably the person who has the most experience because he rode it throughout its racing career and indeed continued on to the SP 1s and 2s. He said, the first time I saw the bike was at Phillip Island for my first test in 1994. Doug Poulin, the reigning World Superbike champion, and I arrived, and the bike was in just plain white livery. We pulled the bike out of a crate and started riding it. At the time, I was the lap record holder at Phillip Island on the Kawasaki ZRX750. It was 1 minute 38.3 seconds. I managed a 1 minute 40.1 on the new bike, 2 seconds slower. My first thought was, what the hell have I done? I suppose I expected a bit more from Honda. The main letdown was its engine. It just wasn't fast enough out of the box. Everyone thinks Honda has a good top speed. Their bikes have always been fast, so I thought I'd be half a second off. And Doug Poulin was 1.5 seconds, maybe 2 seconds a lap slower than me, so he was 4 seconds off. I think basically Honda underestimated the opposition. Since the RC30, Ducati had moved on a lot by going with a bigger engine and a bigger engine. And from one point of view, the bike had amazing handling because the motor just didn't have enough horsepower, enough grunt. Once it got grunt, then we got into all sorts of handling difficulties. A lot has been made of the RC40's handling issues over the years, and some riders say it was the best thing ever, and some just couldn't ride it, and every rider's different. When Carl Fogarty joined the team in 1996, he said the bike was designed around me. Well, the truth is, it was a production bike, and I rode it like one. I used to have to put my weight in weird places to make the thing turn, because we couldn't just chop the chassis to solve these problems and make it better. I had to adapt my style to something that would work on it. I remember one year we actually tried 6 different single-sided swing arms trying to get the rigidity into the right place, sidewards as well as flexibility upwards as well. That was just to get a better feel and make the tyre last longer, and then we started mucking about with the twin-sided swing arms in the rear, which we thought might preserve the tyre better than the single-sided, and it worked. The idea was we could make it less rigid rather than just a single big piece of aluminium. At the start we were on Dunlops because that was the deal with Doug Poulin. Honda wanted to race on Michelin's, but Doug said he wouldn't sign unless they were on Dunlops. In 1995, Doug left the team and we went back to Michelin's, and then we really got lost. So the problem with the RC45 handling got a whole lot worse. That's when I developed the style of riding right over the front of the bike, getting a lot of weight into the front tyre. The more weight we put on the front, the better it turned, and as long as you get the front loaded up, it was really good. But by then, our engine had a lot of horsepower too, but still no torque, so we'd get a lot of wheel spin. You always knew in the back of your mind by the end of the race you were going to have degraded tyres way more than the other bikes, and you knew that was going to be a problem. And that's what I became known for managing the package until the last 5 laps of the race, because that's when the race really was. So we had a good bike, but we're overriding it so much to live with the twins. Even my teammates, Doug Poulin, a world champion, Carl Fogarty, a world champion, John Kosinski, a world champion, Honda were trying everything. They picked world champion after world champion as a teammate just in case I wasn't doing the job. So we'd come up with the same old. It was really hard to win a race on something that was so stretched to the limit of the regulations. The bike was incredible, but we were chasing something that wasn't in our league. Then, 1998, I was at my optimum. The bike was at the end of its development life, so it was the perfect RC45. Well, actually, it was the perfect 750, put it that way. I did everything, it did everything I wanted. I knew what it was going to do before it did it. And in 1996, when we went to Misano, I had a 16th and 18th on the Michelins. And in 1998, I had a double victory there. So obviously, we had sorted it out. That day, I felt like I had the thing perfect and the opposition sussed. But in that year, I dropped a rod at Monza, I fell off at the Nuremberg, while in second and finished fourth, was involved in crash at the start line at Laguna Seca, and a whole lot of things went wrong. But I still won more races than Carl that year. I just felt I was riding really well and I had the smarts on the opposition. They still had the better package, but I felt I could outride them. It's just that the championship was V-twins and 4 cylinders, and that was hard work. It wasn't until we got our own V-twin years later in 2000 and put it on the dyno. Our V-twin was the same horsepower but 30% more torque. So how fair is that? I found it interesting reading those articles and Aaron's direct comments. You can certainly sense his frustration, and indeed we can understand how he must have felt racing in the series where the odds were stacked against you. Was it unfair? Personally, I don't think so. The regulations applied to all, and Honda eventually reluctantly accepted that if you can't beat them, you have to join them. The SP1 and SP2 both won the championship, ridden by the brilliant Colin Edwards. My question is probably, why didn't Honda recognise the challenge earlier and replace the RC30 with a twin? Personally, I'm glad they didn't. I wouldn't be riding this magnificent bike if they had. It's one of 2 amazing V4 750s that Honda made for racing, and we get the privilege to occasionally see them on the roads. Well, if you enjoyed that half as much as I did, you would have had great fun. Before I come to my concluding thoughts, I want to talk about values. When I stopped at coffee stops, the first question is invariably about rarity and volumes. The second question was, well, how much is that worth? And I thought it might be helpful to share my recent research on that. The cheapest bike that I found was a bike that was sold in Ireland last year for £31,000. Now, I suspect, I didn't see close-up photographs of it, that may have needed a bit of work and probably had quite a few miles on it. The most expensive bike that I found is the one that sold at Iconic Bike Auctions, the American company, and that was what I call a push bike. It hadn't done any miles at all, the engine hadn't been run, and it went for £78,000. Now, I personally like to see bikes like these ridden, but that's because I'm an enthusiast, not a collector. And bikes with a bit of mileage on and that have been used probably go between £30,000 and £40,000. I think this one, because it's been particularly well looked after, it's done 19,000 miles, probably towards the upper end of that scale rather than the lower end of the scale. Now, I ride a lot of 30, 40 and 50-year-old bikes. They are great trips down memory lane, but often I get off them and I'm looking forward for the opportunity to ride something modern with its modern engines, suspension, technology, and easier to ride. Now, I was really pleasantly surprised by how capable this bike is, even seen through a modern lens. I would not have guessed if I hadn't known that this was a 30-year-old bike. It is, for me, an exciting and, for a homologation bike, surprisingly comfortable bike to ride. It encourages you to ride it as briskly as you can. I've done 160 miles on this bike, and to be honest, I'd quite happily do another 500, which is not what I always say when I get off classic bikes like this. Now, is it the best road 750 that I've ever ridden? If I'm honest, I don't think it is. I suspect my last of the run Gixxer 750s is probably an easier and faster bike to ride than this. But that shouldn't detract from what this is. This is an iconic Honda, one of only 2 bikes that they made in 750 format to race in World Superbikes. It's exciting, easy to ride, and beautiful to look at. My thanks again to Mike for the very generous and trusting loan of the bike. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you had, you might be kind enough to press like or even consider subscribing for the channel. But what is most important is that you ride safe and that you stay well.